Welcome back. Welcome back. This week it was reported that senior officials from the Afghan government, the UN, the Taliban and Pakistan's intelligence services met with one another in Kabul, or Kabul, whichever you prefer. The delegates allegedly came together for an unofficial three-day conference in a hotel in the Afghan capital. Both official government spokesmen and Taliban sources deny that high-level negotiations are taking place. So just what is happening behind the scenes in Kabul? To find out more, I'm joined from Springfield, Massachusetts, where better to be to keep an eye on what's going on in Kabul, by the former United Nations Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan, Peter Galbraith. Peter, is this alleged set of meetings the real thing, do you think?
Some people know, but we who are on the outside do not know. There is a lot of reporting about meetings, and it is logical to think that such meetings might be taking place. At the moment, the Taliban must feel that they have the upper hand, and so if there's to be a settlement and they are to get much of what they want, it may not be a bad time for them to negotiate. There are also internal dynamics within the Taliban that might argue for them to negotiate. The report suggests that there have been separate meetings with the Quetta Shura, which is the, if you will, the main branch of the Taliban, headed by Mullah Omar, and then also contacts with the Haqqani network that is based in the border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, a particularly ruthless network that had been created and supported by the CIA in the 1980s. These two groups are potential rivals, and so it may behoove both of them to engage in negotiations now, lest there be some deal or some arrangement which one prevails militarily and the other is left out. On the government side, the Karzai side, it is losing ground internally in Afghanistan. Karzai is handicapped by the election that returned him to power, which was seen by many Afghans, which was massively fraudulent, and therefore he's seen as illegitimate by many Afghans. Now parliamentary elections, which also seem to have been characterized by massive fraud. And he also sees clear impatience on the part of the United States and other Western backers with him. He sees them pressuring him to do things that he doesn't want to do, notably to clean up corruption, to deal with his two brothers. And so he has some incentive to negotiate. And the United States, it's clear that the Obama administration, if you read Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, that many of the senior people who are behind the strategy, possibly including the president himself, do not believe in it, do not think it will work. And so they too would like to see a negotiated settlement so that the U.S. can get out and this issue can get off the table.
But as long as America is spouting out these very defeatist statements and so on, such as you've quoted, why would the Taliban go for any settlement other than an outrageous humiliation of Karzai and the Americans?
Well, it is true that the Taliban have no incentive to negotiate on the terms that Karzai has put forward, which include renouncing violence, accepting the Afghanistan constitution. But they would have an incentive to have a settlement that would give them a slice of power, in which their strong position on the ground was translated into a political settlement. And the Taliban also does recognize certainly the limits of its reach in Afghanistan. It is a movement that exists almost exclusively among the Pashtun community in Afghanistan, which is slightly less than half the population of the country, concentrated in the south and the east. The Taliban are vehemently opposed by the other communities, the Tajiks, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks, and they know that they would never have the military strength, even if all the foreign forces withdrew, to conquer Kabul or all of Afghanistan. So while they don't need to have a political settlement to control the South, which they more or less control now anyhow, they do need a political settlement if there's going to be peace and if they're going to have a influence in the national government. And that's what they can get from negotiating with Karzai.
So you think, do you, though, that President Obama is trying to get the troops out of there too quickly, and perhaps a number of the military feel that too, that we are in fact conceding Afghanistan by leaving too soon?
Not at all. I think President Obama made a big mistake in increasing the number of troops in Afghanistan and for a counterinsurgency strategy that, on the terms of its architects, will not work. And that is because the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan requires an Afghan partner to work, an Afghan partner, an Afghan army that can provide security, an Afghan police that can provide law and order, and an Afghan government that can provide honest administration and win the loyalty of the population. And President Obama knows that none of those things exist, that there is no partner, therefore the strategy cannot work. It was, I think, wrong, therefore, to commit 100,000 troops to a strategy that cannot work, and for him now to be looking for a way to move back from that position to begin to withdraw troops makes a lot of sense. Afghanistan is far from the most important place in terms of U.S. national security, and it's a big misallocation of resources to have so much in Afghanistan and certainly to have them in implementing a strategy that cannot succeed.
What do you think we will be looking at when we look at Afghanistan in 10 years' time from now? What do you see as Afghanistan's immediate and medium-term future?
I don't see that the international presence is going to remain, and it's likely that the country will be very fragmented, that a very conservative Islamic movement will control Kandahar and the Pashtun areas in the south, the Taliban or its successors, but in the non-Pashtun parts, there'll be something that is very different. And the best hope is that these two sides will have a kind of loose coexistence. The danger is that what has now been a conflict entirely between Pashtun factions, that is the Pashtun government, the Pashtun Taliban, might become a broader civil war between the Pashtuns and the other communities.
That's a daunting thought. Peter, thank you very much indeed for joining us once again. We look forward to seeing you soon. It seems a long time ago that a country's might was measured by the strength of its currency. A strong pound or dollar was seen as indications of stability and strength. Now the opposite seems to be happening. This week the IMF chief warned against currency wars as China, Japan, even South Korea stand accused of deliberately lowering the value of their currencies in a beggar-my-neighbor attempt to boost exports. Well, this very weekend in Washington, the IMF will be meeting to come up with proposals to try and tackle the currency wars. But can they do anything? And will it work anyway? I'm delighted to be joined by financial journalist Hamish McRae. Hamish, welcome. Can they do anything? What can they move to do? What can the IMF or anyone else do about the currency wars?
The IMF can't do anything.
Right.
It only has words. Other countries can't do a lot. It's very difficult to persuade China to let its currency rise. But you can put pressure on. The US Congress is profoundly concerned about China, and it is threatening various measures that might try and push up the dollar against it. But the only thing you can really do is actually to try and persuade the Chinese that it is in their self-interest to allow their currency to rise, and that is much harder.
The reason for currency to rise means it limits somewhat their exports.
Well, you limit your exports to some extent,
Yeah.
but also you're getting, you're getting a better deal for your own importers. You're reducing the cost of your imports, and you're not building up these huge surpluses that China has done. And then what do you do with the money? You put it into dollar assets and they go down. So that's not very bright either.
And so it sort of focuses in a way on the pressures between China and America. What do we want China to do? What should America do?
Now, the big issue here, the huge issue, is that China is snapping at the heels of America and will, within the next 10, 15 years or so, in all probability pass it in size. It passed Japan this year. Now, it's still a lot smaller now, but if you grow at 8 or 10% a year, vis-a-vis US growing, 3 or 4, 3 if it's lucky, then it doesn't take so long to catch up. And so these two countries are locked in a relationship. Each needs the other. They are the two largest economies on the planet, and they trade tremendously with each other. Each needs the other, but they have to manage this relationship, and it becomes tense.
And at the moment, I mean, I suppose China's feeling slightly less cooperative today, now that one of their dissenters, one of their rebels, has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But in general, what's the level of emotion either way? I mean, you were saying Americans are feeling very strong. Do China feel as strongly or more strongly? Or more ruthlessly but less strongly?
My own conversations with senior Chinese has two themes. One theme is that they do not like to be told what to do by anybody else. You do not lecture them. And when people try and lecture them, they're liable to be greeted very badly. But the second theme, and I think this is very important, relevance to today's news, they do not use economics as a political weapon. They keep in their mind these two separate things. We pursue our economic self-interest as we think is best, whether that's optimal or not, or right or wrong, separate issue. And we also pursue our political things. They don't mix the two. They have never used economics as a way of putting pressure on the US. They put pressure on in other ways. And I think that's really very commendable and responsible of them.
And what should America do now? How should it save more, spend less? What should they do?
America is on a diet of, you might say it isn't quite cold turkey, but it comes a bit to it. It's got to get off the debts. And President Obama knows that, he says it. On the other hand, in the short term, if you start not pumping more money in, if you start trying to reduce your debts, you clobber the economy. So America has to carry out, like the rest of us, a very difficult balancing act. A bit of pressure on China to try to push up the yuan is good news, but it has to keep a balancing act.
To keep a balancing act. And if you were gazing into the future right now, Hamish, would you say that this current crisis is bound for a happy ending? Or does it have to have a happy ending?
I think it is so much in everybody's self-interest that we keep an open world trading system going, that we will keep it going. And I think, remember this, we've had a big recession. If you look at the world as a whole, not just the developed world, because the world as a whole is very similar to the 1970s. If you look at the developed world, it was worse. But in the world as a whole, it's very similar. But we are now in the early stages of a cyclical uplift. There'll be lots of bumps on the way, but I should think that we will have 7 years, whatever, of bumpy growth ahead of us. And the trick is to use that growth phase to get rid of some of all these awful imbalances.
And we'll seize on that word uplift, that we're in sight of uplift as something to encourage us at the end of this particular programme.
There is such a thing as a cycle in the world economy. And that's
there is a cycle in the world economy. Thank you very much indeed, Hamish. So grab that word, uplift. That's all for this week. My thanks to all my guests. Do join us again for a very special edition next week of Frost Over the World.